Welcome back to Dead Good Book Reviews. I'm Judith and you're watching another episode of Overbooked here on the channel. This is the series where I talk about every single book on my shelves because that's just what I do. Today we are talking about The Hobbit. Why do I own a copy of The Hobbit? Well, there is actually a vlog from way back when, I'm talking pre-2020 times, where my mother and I went on a trip to Cheltenham? And I found this copy of The Hobbit and I thought, why not? It's probably still got the price in. I paid £3 for it. There we go. So yes, I did buy this copy for myself. Nobody's paying me to talk about books and all opinions are my own. I'm going to keep this spoiler free. It's The Hobbit. It's been out for a while. I feel like maybe if you don't want to be spoiled for it, you should have read it by now. And I will link the story graph. I have no idea if people will have generated content warnings for The Hobbit. If they are anywhere, they are on Storygraph, and that is linked below. The Hobbit, originally published in September of 1937. It's getting on a bit now. I had to double check this, but it was published before Lord of the Rings, which is wild. When I think about how many things are referenced in The Hobbit that are Lord of the Rings things, I don't know. I have thoughts and feelings about it. It is actually a children's book. It was written for children. I first read it when I was a child, or it was read to me when I was a child by my mum. It works just as well as an adult book. I think it's just as enjoyable. It's kind of timeless in that way. And I don't think I need to do an about the author for J.R.R. Tolkien, do I? I think we can manage. His Wikipedia article is thorough. Likewise, it feels really stupid talking about the plot of The Hobbit, but broadly speaking, we know what hobbits are. If you don't, you're in the wrong video. Go do a little bit of research for yourself and come back to me. Bilbo is a hobbit. Most of the time, hobbits don't go on adventures. Bilbo goes on one. He is recruited by Gandalf to be a burglar for a group of dwarves who are going to reclaim their mountain, which has been stolen by a dragon, so they're off to try and get some treasure back from the dragon, and it's basically an adventure story in that kind of classic fantasy way of we have a goal, we have an aim, and we're taking a fairly meandering route to get there because plot keeps happening. I love Lord of the Rings with all of my being, and by that I do mean the film adaptations, and I'm sure some people are already drafting angry comments below about how I should have read the books by now. I don't want to hear it. I'm not going to listen to it. It's fine. I watched the film adaptations so many times when I was a young person, probably too young to be watching some elements of them. I fell in love with the aesthetics, I love the costumes, I love the plot, I love the storyline. Fantasy films have never beaten the original Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings for me, personally. For me, with the possible exception of Stardust. So I think I probably must have been read The Hobbit by my mum at around about the same time as I was obsessively watching The Two Towers again and again and again. But I've never actually read Lord of the Rings. That's a lie. I have read The Fellowship of the Ring. Struggled through The Fellowship of the Ring probably about 15 or so years ago, and I never continued on with the series. It was just a little bit too dense for me. However, The Hobbit, written for children. A lovely time. I have a great time in this book. It is very, very readable. For this reread, I did listen to the audiobook narrated by Andy Serkis, and I thought it was fantastic, and I do think if I were going to read all of the original Lord of the Rings trilogy, I would listen to those via audiobook as well. But I think something about the way that this story is crafted, while it doesn't feel like a children's book, at least to me, it doesn't feel like the feeling of reading middle grade now. It does feel very accessible and nice and easy to read. So if you were intimidated by reading Lord of the Rings, but you'd like to read some Tolkien, you could read The Hobbit. I think what I like most about this book is the little world-building details that are thrown in, particularly around the kind of culture of hobbits. I just think that fleshing out that world is so fun and something that I didn't have much of from just watching the films. Also, the food descriptions for both the hobbits and the dwarves and how much they care about eating really spoke to me as a person, and I appreciated that. There's a lot more to the relationships in the story than I think you get in, certainly in the Hobbit films, which I don't think we should talk about too much here, but also in my memory of the original book. I'd forgotten a lot about all the characters other than Bilbo, and there are so many really interesting characters in this. So yes, all of that detailed world building, all of that character building. Tolkien's characters aren't always my favourite thing, but I really enjoyed getting to kind of meet all of these different people across this story, and all of the creatures as well, goblins and trolls and all of that stuff. Very cool. And I think just the structure of the adventure is very fun to me, I think partly because it's just through Bilbo's perspective, so you're only following one character, where in a lot of epic fantasy you have to keep track of a bunch of different threads. I think it's Brennan Lee Mulligan talked in an interview I want to say it was on a Critical Role interview at one point. If I can find the clip, I'll link it below, but let's be real, I probably can't. Talked about the idea of storytelling being that characters have a goal that is to go from A to B in a straight line, and the story should still feel like they're trying to go in a straight line, but they're travelling a much more meandering route. And that's definitely how this story felt. That quote is more in the context of tabletop role-playing games, but I do think it applies to this kind of story as well. It really reminded me a lot of Edge Chronicles as well, where you have this character who is just trying to achieve one thing and 50 things happen to them along the way. I really like that storytelling structure. I think it works really well in this book. I think that's part of why it works as an audiobook as well, is that you get these kind of distinct sections of the story. So yes, in terms of that structure, I think that makes The Hobbit work very well. I think I'm going to have to go back and read at least Fellowship just to do a bit of a comparison of the writing style. Whether it feels completely different to me, I don't know. When am I going to do that? I don't know when I'm going to have the time. I do think it's really interesting that Fellowship of the Ring didn't come out until kind of 10 to 12 years later. I did look up the dates, I didn't write them down, but it was a while later, and the amount of things that are referenced in The Hobbit makes it feel like the world building was done. I'm not a Tolkien scholar, I'm not one of those people. It may be that he had planned it all out beforehand. I don't know. It's interesting, and it would be interesting to read The Hobbit with absolutely zero context for Lord of the Rings and just see how it felt reading it completely on its own, because obviously I can't comment on that because I have too much Frodo and Sam in my head. And I think it's probably worth acknowledging that there are a lot of things in this story that, were it not written in 1937, I would be like, hey, bit weird that you didn't include any women, Tolkien. Bit odd that there are 0 women involved in this in any way, shape or form. Maybe I'd have thoughts on that. It's that interesting thing of when you know a story doesn't have that, it's not disappointing to not see them, because you just go in with that expectation of there are no women in this. Again, I keep drawing this comparison to Edge Chronicles, which are obviously much newer than this is. But again, Edge Chronicles, very few female characters, but didn't bother me because I knew that when I was doing the reread that they weren't there. Interesting thoughts. As somebody who doesn't read a lot of kind of like the classics of fantasy and doesn't read a lot of fantasy written by men, I'm very good at switching off my I'm annoyed at this alarm. But if you are a person who really needs female characters to connect into the story, you won't find them in The Hobbit. I already talked about Edge Chronicles as a comparison. I think that is probably the closest thing I've got in terms of my back catalogue of videos I can link you to that feels most similar. Edge Chronicles is a much more sprawling narrative, it's much faster paced, I think, than The Hobbit is, and obviously much newer, but I do think it is worth mentioning. The only other thing that I've talked about recently that is an older book was Ballet Shoes. Drastically different from The Hobbit. But again, 1930s fiction, it's interesting seeing what was coming out contemporaneously. It feels completely bizarre to be telling you whether you should or shouldn't read The Hobbit, but I suppose if I'm talking to you as a person who knows the story but is wondering if it's worth actually picking the book up, I would say it is. I think it was a good reading experience, and it gave me confidence that I could read more Tolkien again if I wanted to, and it also helped cement in my head that when I do that, I will want it in audio format. Obviously, I know that the writing style is going to be different, but I just think it's going to click in my head, and it's really satisfying to be able to say, yes, I have read this, because while I did read it as a child, it had been long enough that I didn't really remember most of what had happened. Did I forget that a battle happens? Absolutely. Have you read this? Are you a Lord of the Rings fan? Where does your Lord of the Rings fandom come from? Mine is definitely from watching the movies too much as a child, but I would love to hear from you whether you encountered the books first, whether you encountered the animation first. Please do let me know. And if you've never read any Tolkien and you think you might now like to pick up The Hobbit, please do tell me, because I would love to hear that from you, and I would like to then have a follow up on how you felt it went. While you are down there commenting, if you haven't already, please do subscribe. It makes me feel loved and appreciated. You can also follow me on social media. Come hang out on Discord where we have chill chats about books. I'd like to say an enormous thank you to all the ghosts who haunt me over on Patreon. They support the channel and in return get early access to videos, bonus content, live streams, and more. If you'd like to join their number, that's linked below as well. Thank you so much for watching. That's all from me, and I will see you in the next one.